My name is Samantha Quinn, and I'm 39 years old. The last time my family saw me, I was standing in my brother's kitchen, clutching a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, while his wife politely explained that I shouldn't feel obligated to attend my niece's wedding. She smiled in that way people do when they're trying to sound kind but really just want you gone. "It's going to be a very formal affair," she'd said, her eyes drifting to my worn jeans and plain t-shirt. "I'd hate for you to feel out of place." My brother, Mark, always eager to keep the peace, nodded in agreement without looking me in the eye. He said something about how stressful weddings could be, how maybe I'd enjoy a quiet weekend instead. I remember that moment clearly because it was the first time I truly understood that they weren't just embarrassed by me, they were ashamed of me. They believed the story I'd let them believe, that after leaving the army, I couldn't find stable work and ended up folding shirts and running a cash register at a discount store off the highway. To them, that made me a failure, a cautionary tale they could whisper about when the conversation turned dull. My brother Mark had once called it my retail phase, as if it were something I'd eventually outgrow. His wife, Lila, avoided eye contact whenever I spoke, her polite laughter reserved for everyone else at the table. I thought back to the conversation 5 years ago, right after I resigned my commission, when I told them I wasn't cut out for corporate life. Mark had smiled then, too, a patronizing look that said he'd known all along I wouldn't make it. The disdain had always been there, subtle, rooted in their conviction that my life choices, the military, the missions, the secrecy were proof of my instability, not my commitment. It wasn't the first time they'd looked at me that way, but it was the first time they said it out loud. I sat there listening, nodding, pretending their words didn't sting. I'd learned long ago how to keep my face still when I was hurting. The army had taught me discipline, but family had taught me silence. I told them I understood, that I'd send a gift, and that it was fine. Inside, though, something cracked. I'd faced combat zones that felt safer than that kitchen. After dinner, Mark walked me to the door like a guest who couldn't wait to see me leave. He pressed a folded check into my hand, said it wasn't much, but maybe it could help me get back on my feet. I looked at it without unfolding it. The number didn't matter. What it represented did. To him, I wasn't his sister anymore, just someone he pitied. I left it on the counter, thanked him anyway, and walked out into the cold evening air. Driving home that night, I kept replaying their words, each one landing harder than the last. It wasn't just about missing a wedding. It was about everything that came before it. The unspoken judgments, the sideways glances, the way they had rewritten my life into something small enough for them to feel superior to. They thought they knew me, but they didn't. They knew the version of me that was easy to look down on, the one who didn't make them uncomfortable. I pulled into my driveway long after dark and sat in the car for a while, engine humming, hands gripping the steering wheel. I had spent years serving my country, leading teams through missions most people couldn't imagine. Yet, somehow, it was this quiet rejection that left me shaking. For a moment, I wondered if maybe they were right. If maybe I really didn't belong anywhere anymore. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. I reminded myself that belonging doesn't come from being accepted. Sometimes it comes from standing alone and knowing your worth, even when no one else does. By the time I went inside, the decision was already forming in the back of my mind. I wasn't going to defend myself. I wasn't going to explain or beg them to see me differently. Let them think what they want. The truth had its own timing, and one day, it would walk right through their perfect little world wearing a uniform they could never ignore. What my family didn't know, and could never have imagined, was that for the last 3 years, I wasn't working the register at a strip mall clothing store. I was undercover, embedded in a joint federal task force focused on dismantling a weapons trafficking operation that stretched from rural Texas all the way up to Chicago and beyond. The so-called retail job was part of my cover. It wasn't just folding shirts. I was carefully positioned at that specific location because the company's owner had an unusual logistics connection to our targets. Everything was planned down to the threadbare apartment, the dated car, the fake bank statements. I had an entire life on paper that painted me as someone barely scraping by. It was convincing because it had to be. The people we were tracking were smart, ruthless, and extremely well connected. I had been recruited straight out of active duty by the Office of Special Investigations. My military background, combined with my clean record and low-profile lifestyle, made me the perfect fit for long-term infiltration. I spent weeks memorizing my new identity, rehearsing every detail of my real life, until it felt like muscle memory. I had to become her. No one outside the task force knew. Not my friends, not my neighbors, and definitely not my family. That was the hardest part. The silence. I remember having to participate in a coworker's endless complaints about a $2 wage mistake, having to feign outrage over a broken espresso machine, all while I was tracking the movement of military-grade explosives across state lines. Every absence made me look more disconnected, more like the family embarrassment they thought I was. I remember the day I walked into the fake job for the first time. The manager handed me a cheap name tag that read, Sam Q. I smiled, folded it into my pocket, and got to work pretending I was someone who'd lost her way. I learned how to blend in, how to be invisible in plain sight. You'd be surprised how quickly people stop seeing you when they think they've figured you out. Every morning, I woke up and reported in using a burner phone. Every night, I filed intel under a false login on a secure line. I tracked shipments, built timelines, and monitored conversations. I stood 3 feet from men who wouldn't hesitate to shoot me if they knew who I was. Once, the lead lieutenant of the operation brushed past me in the break room, his eyes scanning my face for a flicker of recognition. I kept my breathing even, concentrating on the price tag I was clipping, pretending my heart wasn't trying to hammer its way out of my chest. But it wasn't just the criminals who believed it. My family did too. Every time they called, and I let it go to voicemail, every time I dodged questions about my life, it added weight to their assumptions. They thought I was ashamed of where I ended up. They thought I had nothing to say because I'd failed. The truth was, I had everything to say. I just couldn't afford to speak. That life, those 3 years, they took more from me than I'll ever fully get back. But I did it, knowing the mission was worth it. The weapons we stopped, the fully automatic rifles, the fragmentation grenades were intended for use against local police and civilians. Preventing that outcome was the constant, silent anchor that kept me grounded, knowing that every lie I told, every humiliation I silently endured, was building towards something bigger than myself. And one day, when it was finally over, I knew the truth would speak louder than any defense I could have offered along the way. It all came down on a cold Tuesday morning in March. After nearly 3 years of building trust and feeding the task force intel piece by piece, we had everything we needed. Names, routes, suppliers, and enough evidence to justify simultaneous raids across 5 cities. I was the one who confirmed the final drop. I met with the top lieutenant in a parking lot behind a hardware store and watched him load the crates into an unmarked van. That handshake sealed the operation. Within hours, tactical teams moved in. 17 arrests, 5 illegal arms caches, and 2 cartel-connected financiers were brought in, without a single shot being fired. It should have felt like a movie ending, but all I felt was tired. Not the kind of tired you shake off with coffee, but a deep weariness that settles in your bones. I remember standing outside one of the warehouses, the flashing lights casting everything in red and blue, and realizing I had no idea what came next. Back at the field office, the mood was celebratory. Agents clapped me on the back. The director himself called to thank me for my commitment. I was handed a folder with my updated clearance, a new badge, and orders to take as much leave as I needed. My supervisor caught me in the hallway as I was packing up. He looked me in the eye and said, "It's done. Go home, Sam." That was the first time in years anyone called me by my real name. The next 48 hours were a blur of disorientation. I kept reaching for the burner phone that wasn't there, checking for threat indicators that didn't exist. The quiet of my real apartment felt unnerving. I was Sam Quinn again, But the woman who folded shirts was still in my muscle memory, a ghost in my own skin. But as I crossed the state line, I thought about the invitation I wasn't supposed to receive. Mark had texted me the wedding date out of habit, probably forgetting I wasn't invited anymore. Still, the message sat unread in my phone, like a challenge, waiting to be answered. I could have flown to Hawaii, disappeared somewhere warm, and let them go on believing I was folding t-shirts and barely making rent. But something in me wanted to be seen. Not for revenge, not to rub their faces in the truth, just to remind them that I existed, and that I had never been what they thought I was. So instead of booking a beachside retreat, I took out my old uniform, had it pressed, and fueled up the government-issued SUV one last time. I didn't know exactly what I was walking into, but after everything I'd been through, I wasn't afraid of a wedding. The parking lot was already full when I pulled in. A valet waved me toward a reserved space, but when he caught sight of the government plates and the uniform, he didn't ask questions. I stepped out of the SUV, adjusted the collar of my dress blues, and walked toward the entrance of the country club, with the sun hitting my badge, just enough to catch a few stares. The security guy at the door looked up, clearly bored, until his eyes landed on me. He straightened, scanned my insignia, then quietly stepped aside. "Welcome, ma'am," he said, not asking for a name or invitation. Inside, everything smelled like money. Polished wood floors, fresh-cut flowers in tall vases, servers balancing champagne on silver trays. I followed the muffled sound of music and chatter toward the ceremony space. The wedding had already started. I slipped in through the back without a word and found an empty seat behind a row of guests, talking about investment portfolios and ski homes. My hands rested in my lap, still and steady, as I watched my niece standing at the altar in a white designer gown. From my seat, I subtly observed Mark and Lila. They were glowing, exchanging self-satisfied glances, completely unaware that their world was about to be nudged off its axis. He hadn't seen me yet. The ceremony moved along with polished ease. Vows were exchanged. Rings were slipped onto fingers. Every detail was flawlessly rehearsed, down to the string quartet, playing softly in the background. I felt like I was watching a scene from a life I'd never been allowed to touch, but I also felt the quiet power of simply being there. I was standing near the bar, sipping club soda and keeping to myself when I heard it. A group of well-dressed guests was laughing softly, just loud enough to be heard, as one of them said, "Isn't it sad?" I heard Mark's sister works retail. "Can't even hold down a real job." Another chimed in, "Some people just never recover from a career mistake. Poor thing. You just wish she'd find some stability." Oh, I stepped toward them slowly, my heels silent on the polished floor. "Excuse me," I said, calm and even. I couldn't help overhearing. "I think you're talking about me." They turned, startled. One woman blinked, unsure whether to smile or apologize. A man beside her looked me up and down, clearly confused by the uniform. I let the silence stretch just a second longer before continuing. "You might remember me as the woman who works retail." "Oh." I reached into my jacket and pulled out my credentials. The leather wallet snapped open to reveal my badge and photo ID. "Captain Samantha Quinn, U.S. Army veteran. My recent assignment was a joint federal investigation that required complete anonymity due to its sensitive nature." The woman who'd spoken first went pale. Her glass trembled slightly in her hand as her eyes dropped to the ID. We didn't know," she stammered. "That's quite a career." "Oh, it's been an intense few years," I said quietly. "I can assure you, the stakes were considerably higher than folding t-shirts." I folded the ID back into my jacket and looked up just in time to see Mark and Lila pushing through the crowd. Mark's face went from confident to suspicious. His wife froze, halfway to a word she couldn't finish. "Sam?" he said, his voice tight with a mix of suspicion and annoyance. "What is going on? What is this uniform?" I turned to face them, voice steady. Just wanted to say hi. Thought it might be a good time to reintroduce myself. Lila was the first to speak, her voice shaky and too soft for someone who usually commanded a room. This is crazy, Sam. What is this? Some kind of joke? We were worried about you, and now you show up like this? She looked like she wanted to cry, but part of me couldn't tell if it was guilt or just embarrassment that someone else had seen behind the curtain. Mark stood beside her, eyes darting between my face and the onlookers, trying to save face. He didn't say anything at first, just stared. I watched him try to connect the woman in front of him with the story he had written about me in his head for years. Then my mom stepped forward. She hadn't said a word during the ceremony, but now she looked at me like she didn't know whether to hug me or apologize. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, almost childlike, as if the truth was something she didn't feel ready to carry. I didn't raise my voice or get defensive. I just said, "Because I couldn't. My work required total silence. Not even my family could know. And honestly, after the way you all treated me for 3 years, assuming I was a failure, I didn't think you'd listen if I tried to explain anything complex." Nobody had a response to that. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant, nervous clinking of glasses. I let it hang there, let them sit with the weight of what they had assumed, what they had ignored. "I wasn't hiding because I was ashamed," I continued. "I was working, serving. And the sad truth is, the criminal network I was investigating was less of a risk than the constant judgment I faced from my own family. I expected the criminals to try and expose me. I was surprised you didn't trust me enough to assume better. My words weren't meant to hurt, but truth has a way of cutting all on its own." Lila reached out like she wanted to take my hand, but I stepped back. I wasn't ready for that. "Maybe someday. Not now. I'm not here for an apology," I said. "I came because I wanted to stand in my own skin for once. No lies, no pretending, just me." Mark finally found his voice, stuttering slightly. "Can we talk later? Just the two of us?" I had no idea, Sam." I looked at him. The brother who once handed me a check like a parting gift. "Maybe," I said, "but I need time to figure out if I'm interested in that kind of relationship anymore." None of them tried to argue. Maybe they finally understood that I didn't owe them anything. I hadn't come to prove a point. I came to reclaim the space they tried to push me out of. I wasn't the woman they whispered about anymore. I had never been. As I turned to walk back toward the bar, I could feel the weight of their stares following me. Not with shame this time, but something closer to respect. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need. I left the country club just after sunset. The sky still streaked with the last hints of gold and pink. My dress blues were still crisp. My badge still shining. But something inside me had softened. Not in weakness, but in relief. The drive was quiet, just the hum of tires on pavement and the low rhythm of my thoughts. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel the need to prove anything. There was a time when their approval felt like everything. I used to measure my worth by how small I could make myself to fit their comfort. That time was over. What they thought they saw in me was never who I was. I had just gotten too tired to explain, so I let them believe the story that was easiest for them to accept. But tonight, I wrote my own ending. I walked into a room that tried to erase me, and I stood tall without raising my voice. That was enough. I don't know what comes next for me and my family. Maybe nothing. Maybe something new, slower, and quieter. But I'm not waiting around for it. I've already given years to silence and sacrifice. The rest is mine, and I intend to live it without apology. Sometimes, the loudest revenge is silent dignity.